Hi, I'm Jeff Helgeson here at Heirloom Books at 6239 North Clark Street in Chicago, Illinois, and continuing with a series of great book presentations. Today, I'd like to refer back for a moment to a bit of the context I mentioned last time for the plays of Aristophanes. Specifically, this is in terms of some of the philosophers who emerged in ancient Greece between the 5th and 3rd centuries before the current era. The worldview that these thinkers expressed while attempting to use reason to discern truth represented a significant shift away from the mythological explanations of things that have preceded them for thousands of years to such materialistic interpretations of the world as the notion that all things are made of water, a solid, liquid, or gaseous substance, or fire, energy, or empty space and bits of material too small to be cut, called atoms, notwithstanding the 1932 University of Cambridge successful splitting demonstration to the contrary. These materialistic notions were subsequently questioned by moral philosophers such as Socrates and Plato in terms of their relevance to daily human life. Then, later, during and after the time of Aristotle's pupil, Alexander the Great, from around 334 BCE to the Roman conquest of Greece 188 years later, a movement of skepticism, the belief that appearances of things can never be trusted, was followed by one of early scientific humanism, chiefly led by a non-aristocratic philosopher named Epicurus, who rejected the ideas of Plato, many of which were later adopted by Christianity, included women within his school in Athens called the Garden, and had lived from 341 to 270 BCE. Although only a few fragments of the approximately 300 works written by Epicurus himself have survived, thanks to a Roman poet from approximately 150 years later named Titus Lucretius Carus, about whom very little is known other than that he was born in Pompeii 15 years before the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. An extensive overview of the thought of Epicurus does exist, even though its survival and rediscovery is fairly miraculous. As described in a 2011 National Book Award winning work by Stephen Greenblatt titled The Swerve, How the World Became Modern, in 1417, a humanist book hunter named Poggio Bracciolini discovered a copy of Lucretius' 6-volume, 7,400-line poem at the library of a Benedictine abbey in central Germany. Copied, and its contents liberated from obscurity after more than 600 years, this poem on the nature of things, combined with a resurgence of interest in classical Rome among members of the generations following the Black Death, served to foster the intellectual movement called the Renaissance. Still, the incredible chain of events connecting the ideas of Epicurus to the modern world don't end with the rediscovery of Lucretius' text. There's also the way in which it came into existence in the first place, which should probably be considered. I mean, Lucretius lived some 200 years after Epicurus, and just about when Christianity began to take hold of people's imagination. This was the time during which the Roman poet Horace observed, "Captive Greece took captive her uncouth conqueror, and brought the arts to the rustic Latin lands." My guess is that Lucretius undertook the writing of On the Nature of Things in an attempt to popularize the ideas of the Greek philosopher as a way of providing a practical worldview by the means of a literary entertainment for a sophisticated audience along philosophical poem. Unfortunately, pretty much all that's known about Lucretius comes from an opposing ideological camp which derived a good deal of its philosophical foundation from the idea of a separate plane of existence to that of the physical world. About 300 years after the Roman poet's death, St. Jerome, who wrote the colloquial or vulgate Latin version of the Bible, claimed that Lucretius had gone crazy because of a love potion. I'm not sure if it was supposed to be number 9 or not, and then wrote his poem, later edited by Cicero, while he was insane and before committing suicide. Well, how would St. Jerome know 300 years after the fact? One wonders if his undercutting of Lucretius' credibility might not have just a little something to do with what Epicurus had in fact said, proposing, like Madonna's 1984 recording, a material world which requires and has no other levels of existence. Now, with respect to a consideration of the particulars regarding Lucretius' text, I must admit that, to paraphrase Shakespeare, having no Latin and less Greek, I am entirely dependent upon my 1946 Charles E. Bennett translation of the poem into English. To begin, the title, as translated from Latin, is itself a translation from Greek of the phrase on nature to on the nature of things. The poem begins, like the works of Homer, with a rhetorical evocation of a goddess, in this case, the personification of love and the life force itself, Venus, whose receipt of a golden apple as a result of the judgment of Paris is supposed to have caused the abduction of Helen of Troy and a subsequent 10-year-long war. Venus, the celestial grandmother of Aeneas, the legendary second-best Trojan warrior after Hector, who, in the epic poem by Virgil, written just a few decades following the death of Lucretius, is described as having led a group of Trojan refugees across the Mediterranean Sea to eventually found Rome. The next section of the first book presents the theory of Democritus, to which Epicurus ascribed, essentially, that the world is comprised of tiny bits of matter called atoms without relevance upon any gods or Aristotle's unmoved mover to have initiated creation. Continuing into the second book, Lucretius explains Epicurus' theory that, falling through empty space, the atoms swerve into one another, causing chain reactions which result in the existence of the world as it appears to human beings, including the development of life in its various forms. Then, in Book 3, the subject shifts beyond the mere fact of material existence to the implications which can be drawn from it. First, since human beings, like the rest of the material world, are made up of atoms, they do not need to fear forces coming from a non-existent spiritual realm. Also, As finite beings who live and die through a natural process that is shared by all other creatures, there's no need to fear death as anything more than the same absence of being which had preceded conception and birth, although the process of dying still needs, well, to be put up with. A third point, that is, what is good is easily obtained. And then, fourthly, there really is such a word, things that are difficult, like dying, can best be tolerated by recalling past pleasures. So, freedom from fear of the gods, whether many or merely one, makes it possible to live a happy life. Death is only non-existence, not a source of potential eternal punishment. Having simple needs allows them to be easily fulfilled, and taking pleasure in the enjoyment of things helps one endure hardships. The big lesson: death is nothing to us. Or, as my Bennett translation of Lucretius states, so when this life of ours shall be no more, when soul and body part wherefrom ourselves are knit in one, then surely naught can bring distress to us, who have no being, nor stir our sense to feeling, nay, not should even earth be mingled with the sea, and sea with sky. In other words, as John Lennon would have it, imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us, above us only sky. Imagine all the people living for today, and so on and so forth. This worldview, that existence is what it is and should be made the best of for as long as possible, well, was given a somewhat trivialized interpretation in a conflated expression derived from the King James Bible's Ecclesiastics, a man hath no better thing under the sun than to eat and to drink and to be merry, with Isaiah's let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we shall die, which is commonly extended to a you only live once, or YOLO, mindset that the Washington Post has recently described as a current teen interjection for the Latin carpe diem, or seize the day, which the Canadian rapper Drake has popularized in his song The Motto. I suppose it's easy to appeal to a material existence that is what it is, so we better make the best of it, which provoked the disinformation campaigns against both Epicurus and Lucretius that St. Jerome and many others have participated within. Wishful thinking clearly can be a very powerful force. Rather than accepting things as they are, it's perhaps emotionally satisfying to feel there must be something more. That undiscovered country of William Shakespeare's Hamlet, as well as the belief expressed in the book of Matthew, rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven, counterbalanced against Revelations. And if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. However, although the consolation of eternal life and the resurrection of the body can be reassuring, it's that constant fear of endless punishment which might just outweigh the promise for many, many people. But then, toss in the prospect of the forgiveness of sins, and you might really have something. Yet, on the other hand, take away the notion of the eternal soul, along with heaven and hell, and what's left is a life to be enjoyed through the simple practice of seeking pleasure in terms of what lifestyle media mogul Martha Stewart would call a good thing, and attempting to avoid pain as being inherently evil in order to best enjoy what life has to offer as long as it lasts, and then just leave things at that. So what happened for over 1400 years? Atomic theory, a kind of evolutionary development through the randomness of a process of natural selection, encouragement to enjoy life and avoid suffering, taking consolation from past pleasures during times of pain without fear of anything after death. Isn't that a good thing? Well, anyway, the challenge to the Epicurean view of the world appears to have come from two different sources at two distinctly different periods of time. The followers of aristocratic philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, who had enjoyed the patronage of kings to sustain them, seem to have seen Epicurus as a kind of underclass upstart who allowed women into his school, and in his assertion that the soul was not immortal, was in point of fact a natural enemy to the basic premises of their fundamental systems of thought. Later, when championed by Lucretius in what was a fairly widely circulated text with On the Nature of Things, the meek, in terms of the early Christians, having their entire system of belief based upon the notion of the life to come after death, were especially threatened by Epicureans, even to the point of recharacterizing pleasure in virtually all its forms as sin, and interpreting its wages to be death, followed of course by eternal punishment. St. Augustine, who brought the Platonic view of things into Christianity through his own experience, as described in his Confessions, represented sexual pleasure, for example, as merely hedonistic debauchery. Then, in his book, The City of God, Augustine further sketched out the two worlds of physical and spiritual reality, which became both a refutation of Epicurus and Lucretius, and, with the collapse of Western Roman civilization, the picture of the world that predominated for the next 1,000 years. As Stephen Greenblatt explains in The Swerve, it was only luck that brought the ideas of Epicurus back from the ash can of history and made them available to influence the thinking of early humanists, such as Erasmus in his praise of folly, and other individuals ranging from Copernicus and Galileo to René Descartes, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Albert Camus. Greenblatt specifically states, "It was by chance that a copy of On the Nature of Things made it into the library of a handful of monasteries, places that had buried seemingly forever the Epicurean pursuit of pleasure. It was by chance that a monk laboring in a scriptorium somewhere or other in the 9th century copied the poem before it moldered away forever. And it was by chance that this copy escaped fire and flood and the teeth of time for some 500 years until one day in 1417 it came into the hands of the humanist who proudly called himself Progius Florentinus, Progio the Florentine. Chance, or good fortune, perhaps even divine providence, God being said to work in mysterious ways, the resurgence of Epicureanism made itself felt, as observed in the utilitarianism of Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, with the contention that all things are good or evil by virtue solely of the pain or pleasure which they produce. The influence of and resistance to Epicurean ideas was then also felt in American popular culture throughout the decades following the Second World War and the use of the release of atomic energy to end the conflict. As Elizabeth Ferragino, in her book titled Playboy and the Making of the Good Life in Modern America, points out, Hugh Hefner's magazine, she states, offered a veritable handbook for how to acquire the finer things while enjoying life every step of the way. And like Epicurus and Lucretius, the prospect of pleasure for its own sake, as well as support of integration and civil rights and women's reproductive freedom, again brought advocacy for self-fulfillment and pleasure-seeking lifestyle into the crosshairs of established religion, second-wave feminism, as represented by the shift from Helen Gurley Brown's Cosmopolitan magazine and Sex and the Single Girl to Gloria Steinem's A Bunny's Tale article about the 11 days she spent working in a New York Playboy club and Ms. Magazine, and even the civic administration of Chicago's longtime Mr. Mayor, Richard J. Daley, ultimately driving the lifestyle State Street, that great street, mansion home base, out of the city to relocate in the hedonistic center of the universe, Los Angeles, the city of angels. Next time, in contrast to On the Nature of Things, I'll be addressing the other side as presented by St. Jerome and many additional people in terms of the New Testament of the Bible. I'm Jeff Helgeson, and Heirloom Books is located at 6239 North Clark Street in Chicago, Illinois, and is open 7 days a week from noon until 7 o'clock in the evening.